so much for being here. Again, I'm Cecilia Lei, the president of the AAJA San Francisco Bay Area chapter. As we were designing this workshop, we anticipated there would be a really, a good amount of interest, but the size of this group has really exceeded our expectations. And I'm just really encouraged to see so many of you care about this topic enough to join us after a day of work or any other commitments you may have had. So thank you. This workshop was created in partnership with SPJ NorCal and the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And the focus of today's discussion is solidarity. It was designed with journalists and newsrooms in mind, with the hopes that reporters, editors, and other newsroom members can examine their own coverage and broaden community discussions to include the potential for what we're calling solidarity reporting. So as journalists, we don't really talk about solidarity often, and our industry doesn't provide an easy way for us to explore building meaningful dialogue about and with those who are being directly impacted or harmed. But at the same time, we also know that so many news stories that have followed the traditional newsroom playbooks have seriously missed the mark in their coverage of anti-Asian racism and violence. And we saw that in news coverage that rendered invisible the lived experiences of the Asian women who were murdered in Atlanta on March 16th, in stories that have lacked critical nuance and context, creating potential to deepen existing divisions between Asian and Black communities. And overall, just a lack of specificity in amplifying the Asian American experience, which continues to homogenize our very large and very diverse community. There's been, as you know, more attention than ever on Asian Americans, and this kind of momentum of visibility is precisely why we think a focus on solidarity is really important. And as members of the press, we have the ability to either forge new understanding around complex topics or perpetuate old narratives that have contributed to the hate that we're seeing play out on the streets of our communities today. So this workshop, I think, and I hope it will be a moment for us to take a pause, maybe a deep breath, and think about a paradigm shift for journalists to consider how we talk about the pain in the Asian American community right now. And I'm very, very excited that you all will have the opportunity to listen to the brilliance of Anita Varma, a media ethics researcher and SPJ NorCal board member, who has helped journalists implement solidarity in their reporting of impacted communities and groups across various topics. And she was also, fun fact, my lecturer when I was at the Berkeley J School. So this all feels very, very full circle. I'm also thrilled that we get to bring in the voices of Bay Area journalists who have been doing this kind of complex reporting. We'll hear from Vivian Ho and Abené Clayton, who reported a piece in The Guardian about Asian and Black community solidarity. It's a story that stands out to me because I think it exemplifies both the tough complexity and the uniqueness of the Bay Area. And it's a piece that hits on allyship, something that we've all been thinking about so much, especially since our country's racial reckoning really came to the forefront last summer. And we'll also hear from Janelle Bitker, a food reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who wrote a deeply reported piece about Bay Area Asians who have experienced this harm firsthand. As we know, many newsrooms don't have an Asian American community beat, though I really wish they did, but perhaps you'll hear some ideas from her on how you can weave in this kind of work into the reporting that you're already doing. And we'll give all of you an opportunity to ask questions to our panelists as well. And afterwards, time permitting, we're going to see how the conversation goes. But if time allows, we want to also give you all an opportunity to engage with one another and hear your ideas in our quick breakout rooms towards the end of the workshop, which I hope you'll stay around for. And lastly, before we kick things off, I want to just highlight that we are obviously talking about incredibly complex and painful topics today. And just to keep those sensitivities in mind, and I want to especially acknowledge the Asian American journalists and storytellers who have been doing the work of amplifying the stories of our communities, not only in this moment, but for a really long time, long before the pandemic and long before Trump was our president. So a lot of Asian American journalists have been carrying the burden of telling the range of stories about the Asian American identity and experience And they certainly can't do it alone. And that's made obviously very obvious now. So we also hope this is an opportunity for many of you to be allies in your newsrooms or whatever workspaces you're coming from, especially now as their voices are finally being heard. And so with that, I turn this over to my fellow co-conspirator of this workshop, Anita Varma.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, and thank you to everyone for being here and taking the time today in what I know is such a busy and difficult time. My name is Anita Varma. As Cecilia mentioned, I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics with support from the Democracy Fund. I'm also an SPJ NorCal board member and really pleased that we were able to partner with AAJA-SF on this event. I also really wanted to start by just thanking Cecilia for all of her leadership to bring all of us together to have this important conversation. So for the next few minutes, I would like to share with you a very brief summary of my research on this idea of solidarity in journalism. And the good news is it's not just an idea, it's an already existing practice. So let me share my screen and tell you a little bit more about what I mean. So whenever I talk about solidarity and solidarity reporting, I do my best to start by explaining what it is I mean by solidarity. As I'm sure many of you know, there are many possible definitions of solidarity. So the one that I really tie myself to is this, that solidarity is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. So solidarity is not just about how we feel, it's about what we do, and specifically what we do and can do together. Now, this commitment to social justice raises the question, inevitably, of what do you mean by social justice? Well, social justice is when everyone's dignity in a society is respected. And dignity is your intrinsic worth by virtue of being a human. This is not dependent or contingent on how long your resume is, how many awards you have. It's not contingent on being a hard worker or a pillar of the community. Those are great things to consider, but it's not dependent on that, right? We have our dignity by virtue of being people. Now, solidarity reporting is concerned with exactly the same things. The only addition to those definitions I just laid out in the context of journalism is that solidarity reporting is a commitment to social justice that translates into action when that action specifically is reporting. So that's the big premise of what I'm going to talk about with you today, which is that the act of reporting itself can be an act of solidarity. Now, of course, we know, having seen a wide range of coverage, both of the rise in anti-Asian racism and many other social injustices, that all reporting about these topics are not the same. Now, one way that we consider how these differences come about is by thinking about framing. So sometimes when I give solidarity workshops, journalists will say, you know, I'm not doing solidarity reporting. I'm not doing any kind of reporting. I'm just reporting what's actually happening. And that works in some cases, but in cases of covering complex issues, there is almost inevitably a process of selection, right? In order to figure out what the story is going to be about and figure out how to make it make sense. There's a scholar in my field named Robert Entman who wrote this many decades ago. He said to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient. And that's something that I'm going to show you some examples of how it's playing out currently. The two kind of prominent frames that we're seeing in coverage of the rise in anti-Asian racism are an isolated incident frame, which I'll say more about in just a minute, and an ongoing social injustice frame. So these are two different ways to cover the same story. Now, isolated incident framing is not unique to this issue. It's quite common, been around for a long time. And in one handbook for journalists, it's described in these terms: telling a story through the eyes of one person or by examining part of the whole, which means what? It means a spotlight on one person, right? There are other people around that one person. It's a spotlight on one incident, on one, in this case, maybe attack, one assault. And we've seen isolated incident coverage happen quite a bit, particularly with the most gratuitous and violent attacks in recent months. The problem with isolated incident framing is that it may miss the forest for the trees, because in isolation, we don't get an account of historical context. We don't get an account of larger current political context, right? And keeping in mind that spotlight is on one incident, one person, one thing that happened, we also don't get an account of the on-the-ground lived experiences beyond that one particular isolated case. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's not because of any bad intentions. At least I've never seen evidence that there's bad intentions on the part of journalists that lead to isolated incident framing. Instead, it comes down often to the dominant criteria that news organizations use quite regularly to deem a story newsworthy. And some of these very common criteria are novelty and surprise. So is it an unexpected turn of events? Does it involve the power elite? Power elite might be folks like the president, the governor, the mayor. If they're involved, we might see more quickly a story become at the top of a news page. Celebrity involvement is also often something that will get issues into the news more readily than without, as well as individualism. So is there a story here where there's someone who's really special, who's really unique, who's really leading and doing something that is, right aligned with the American individualism narrative that each individual makes this unique difference. And there are a few special ones to pay close attention to, as well as magnitude of what's happening today. Many news organizations use this as a really important criteria. Based on everything that's happening in this 24-hour period, is this a big deal? And that's one way to decide what's newsworthy. But another way, and I'm so excited for our panelists to contribute to the conversation today, because they are great illustrations of how this other type of news valuing can work. So with solidarity news values, we see a different set of criteria than those dominant news values I just mentioned. So instead of looking for novelty and surprise, solidarity news values treat as newsworthy ongoing social issues, where it's not surprising. If we just look very briefly, very cursory look at the history, there's nothing surprising. There's certainly nothing novel about some of these issues, but they still matter. As well as rendering newsworthy community organizers. Community organizers are regularly not part of the power elite, and their activities are often overlooked in news coverage that disproportionately focuses on the power elite. Solidarity news values also render newsworthy regular people affected by an issue. You don't need to be a celebrity. You don't need to be someone who is uniquely standing apart from the community with that unique individualism, but simply a person who's affected. And related to that, stories of community cohesion become much more newsworthy under a solidarity frame and logic than a dominant form that would be much more focused on those exceptional individual few. And finally, instead of magnitude of today, solidarity news values really consider the long-term significance. Maybe a bunch of things happen today, such that the aspect related to the issue of a rise in anti-Asian racism, there's an argument that wasn't the most important thing that happened this very day. But how about in the larger scheme of what is happening across months and years? In that case, our calculus may change. So solidarity plays a role in deciding what's newsworthy as a starting point, but how about if you're doing it in practice? So you've decided an issue based on some solidarity news values is indeed newsworthy. Then what do you do? Well, there's three key aspects to solidarity reporting in practice. The first and foremost is starting with the perspectives of people subjected to inhumane conditions they don't control or choose. So there's two really important words in here, and for the sake of my students and for all of you, I put them in bold. So those two terms are starting and subjected to. So starting the story with the perspectives of communities affected means that they are not an afterthought. They're not sidelined in a story about these injustices directly affecting themselves. They're also not, a sidebar or an add-on while power elite get to be front and center. Subjected to inhumane conditions, I think, is a really important aspect of figuring out, well, who within the community, within multiple communities, are we talking about? So we're really talking about folks who are in conditions, enduring conditions, struggling in some cases due to conditions that they did not create. They did not choose this. We, as Asian Americans, did not choose the state of affairs that we find ourselves in. And we can't simply say, tomorrow, we no longer endure these conditions, right? Those are the people who historically and currently US journalists acting in solidarity regularly consider particularly newsworthy and would start the stories by sourcing from them. Second is to consider community-wide impact. So in practice, this means not only talking to the individual who has experienced the assault, but also talking to broader members of the community, as well as community leadership and organizers about what this means. What's the significance of it? There's lots of assumptions we can make, but going into the community to figure out what this impact has actually been takes it in the direction of solidarity. And finally, and also really importantly, is that solidarity stories in practice emphasize the political significance and not just the emotional toll. Emotional toll matters, right? Grief and fear and worry and pain are absolutely part of this story. But if that becomes the entirety of this story, there's a suggestion there that this is doom and gloom and hopeless. And no community is hopeless, right? So getting to the political significance adds a dimension of accounting for the ways that communities and communities in solidarity are trying to take action to stop this. Now, if you've engaged in those practices, you also might be wondering, well, what kinds of stories result from engaging in those practices and using those news values? So there's really 4 types that come up. And I'm going to offer a very succinct version of what those types are and what the overarching narrative in each case gives us. So the first type of solidarity narrative is what's called intragroup solidarity. The second is called civic solidarity. Third is political solidarity. And fourth is moral solidarity. So intragroup solidarity is often the one that folks are most familiar with. This is a narrative of we take care of us. So an example of that in the case of covering a rise in anti-Asian racism would be coverage of community-based safety efforts, right? Things like escorts for elders and for other folks, as well as mutual aid. So this is where the communities affected are not waiting for someone else from the outside. They're not waiting for a bill to pass. They're not waiting for someone else to come in and save us, but to say, we will be here for each other. We'll care for each other and we'll serve one another in that way. The second type of solidarity narrative is civic solidarity. So this kind of story takes it in a little bit of a different direction to, instead of saying we take care of us by centering the perspectives of folks leading and engaging in mutual aid, for example, these stories have a narrative of a threat to our neighbors is a threat to all of us. So with these stories, the frame really emphasizes that this is not just, quote unquote, an Asian story, but local to the Bay Area. It's a Bay Area story. It's an Oakland story. It's a San Jose story. It's a San Francisco story, right? And the logic of this is that it matters for all of us because, in Iris Marion Young's words, people live together, right? It's not the case that Asian American communities live over there and other folks live over there as some clean division. And so we're interrelated on the basis of our shared geography. A third kind of solidarity narrative pushes on the political dimension really hard to offer perspectives that, in the case of covering this story, really emphasize analysts and researchers and activists who argue that we need to transform structural injustice, not just here, but everywhere. And here's how. And these are stories that would explain and position anti-Asian racism as a product of white supremacy, and also in no way a unique product of white supremacy. All the other communities that are placed under attack and threat as a product of white supremacy would be woven together in the narrative that we get through political solidarity. And finally, and in my ongoing work, I argue the most important form of solidarity, but the one we see the least often in many cases, is moral solidarity. So this narrative is boiled down to, please let us live. Here's what we need from you. And these stories are coverage that amplify the needs and pleas of communities for concrete change beyond what the intragroup can do on its own. So remember, intragroup solidarity was we take care of us. But as we all know, and it's definitely a pain point for a lot of us, we can't take care of all of us sufficiently to end what is going on right now, right? And so with moral solidarity, this would be amplifying the calls for change that are coming from within communities affected. Not to say, over there, this outside person, what do they think this community needs? But to say, what does the community say the community needs? And how can that be achieved with support from institutions outside of our own? So what solidarity reporting, and I would argue all reporting, boils down to is a question of our sources. Whose story are we telling? Now, with elite and individual anchored reporting, we hear from probably some usual suspects. We would hear from folks like President Joe Biden, police officers and district attorneys, celebrities. Rihanna was marching the other day, and that was certainly news in a way that other folks marching were not. Daniel Dae Kim, Daniel Wu, these are other celebrities that can make headlines around this story. Institutional experts, these are outside experts. They are experts by virtue of standing outside and analyzing and understanding an issue, and often are in academic institutions, for example. And finally, exceptional individuals from affected communities. So this one gets an asterisk because exceptional individuals may not be elite, but they're sort of rendered and elevated in a way that we hear from them especially, and not from the rest. But with solidarity reporting, we see very stark differences in sourcing compared to the elite and individual anchored stories. So we hear, as I mentioned, first and foremost from people directly affected by violence. Note that's people, plural, not just one. And we hear from communities subjected to increased conditions of fear. So they themselves may not have experienced assaults, hopefully not, but there's still an impact. There's still an effect of these attacks and rhetoric, and it places them under threat and fear based on their ethnicity or presumed ethnicity in cases of racial profiling. As I mentioned, we also hear from community organizers much more under solidarity reporting approaches and folks with expertise based on lived experience. This is what I call inside experts. So these are folks who don't know about an issue because they've read about it. They know about it because they've lived it. And for any of us who have lived experiences, particularly lived struggles, I think you would probably agree that you would know more about it than someone who has heard about it but not walked through it. And finally, there's also space in solidarity reporting to hear from people from overlapping communities. So these may be folks within a metro area or across a diaspora. So we would start with people directly affected and could also include people who are secondarily affected. So now let me offer a couple examples by way of transition into our panel, which again, I'm so looking forward to. So this is an example of elite anchored reporting, which I label here as factual but incomplete. So this is a story that ran in a national news outlet a couple days after the Atlanta shootings. And the third paragraph reads as this: Biden said he was ordering the flags lowered as a mark of respect for the victims of the senseless acts of violence on Tuesday, when police say a lone gunman fatally shot the victims at 3 Atlanta metropolitan spots. Okay, so who are we hearing from? Biden, the president, and we got a paraphrase from police officers. And I'll include links to these afterwards. But what you'll see in this story is that there is no sourcing, there are no quotes from within the affected communities, right? We don't hear from any OPI people in this story that is ostensibly about an issue that is so deeply affecting OPI communities. Now, the reason that I note that this is factual but incomplete is that this is not something where fact checking would really change much of anything, because everything in this story, right, these elite actors and institutional actors, what they said is accurately represented. It's not that anything was fabricated here, but there's an incompleteness because we don't hear from the community subjected. Let's look at the other side of the coin. So this is a fantastic piece that ran in The Guardian on February 21st. It's called Black and Asian Unity, Attacks on Elders Spark Reckoning with Racism's Roots. And there are so many aspects of solidarity reporting in this story. It's only in the interest of time that I'm going to show you just 3, which, please believe me, were very hard to choose just 3. But the story's lead even takes us into solidarity territory right away. So in stark contrast to an isolated incident framing, instead, there's nothing isolated about these incidents, right? This is what it says. A 91-year-old man shoved to the ground in Oakland, California's Chinatown. A 50-something woman thrown into a set of newsstands in Flushing, Queens. An 84-year-old man fatally assaulted in San Francisco. A recent spate of violence against Asian elders has left many Asian Americans across the country feeling targeted, wondering whether these are random acts of crime or fueled by anti-Asian bias. Okay, so we have far from an isolated incident, and the reaction and the validation that there's something that is not okay here is not coming from outside the community. It's not coming from Biden. It's not coming from a researcher. It's coming from how the communities themselves are reacting to this. Later in the story, we also get some of that political context that I was mentioning is sorely missing with isolated incident framing, and directly aligned with the solidarity approach. This is deeply contextualized, that these attacks are not coming out of nowhere. In fact, they have been happening, and against a backdrop of what Vivian and Abené note are a year of pandemic-related challenges, including racist taunts of Kung flu or China virus, economic devastation, and 4 years under an administration whose trade war with China fueled xenophobia. That's political context. That's contemporary context to where this is coming from, what does it stem from, and why it can't be explained away as a random, unfortunate aberration. And finally, on the level of sourcing, we hear from an Oakland organizer. We hear from an Oakland organizer who says this. He says, supporting our Asian community is not about dividing us. This support is for all of us suffering under white supremacy. Hopefully that's ringing a bell around that political solidarity narrative. We need to understand that so we can triumph and have public and personal safety. So I hope you're seeing the resonance here. Now, let it be known that Vivian and Abené did not write this using those initial slides of what a solidarity approach means. It's the reverse, right? So I analyze existing stories to try to synthesize what are the aspects of solidarity already happening. Let's look at one more example. This is a piece written by Janelle Bitker, and it ran in the San Francisco Chronicle at the end of February, called "There's Been a Surge of Attacks Against Asian Americans. Asians in the Bay Area Say the Hostility Isn't New." Okay, isn't new. So that headline and this section on history of Asian scapegoating are 2 of my favorite parts of this story, because it's directly contrary to that chief news value that we see so often in dominant and traditional criteria for deciding what's newsworthy, which would say it's got to be new to be newsworthy. It has to be novel. It has to be surprising. And what Janelle does so fantastically in this piece is to center the history. I hear this claim over and over in media outlets and non-media outlets that say that this has just started last year, that the scapegoating of Asian communities came about because of these accusations around the coronavirus. That is incorrect, right? And Janelle shows us to what extent that's incorrect. A really, really big one. So this history section, also importantly, comes near the top of the piece rather than the end, right? Rather than an add-on, this really sets the tone for understanding the implications of everything that follows. So she writes, officials have specifically scapegoated Asian people for diseases for the past 150 years. That is not novel, not surprising. Definitely checks the box of being ongoing and offers plenty of examples to justify that claim. The last example that I'll offer from this piece is one that, again, I'm just so thrilled to see, because it showcases 2 types of solidarity that I mentioned can come up in the narratives, and that includes moral solidarity and intragroup solidarity in a very succinct way. So sometimes folks are listening to me and they wonder, is this really possible to do with all the constraints that journalism's work under? I'm so pleased that Janelle's piece shows us that it is indeed possible. And we'll hear more from her in just a minute about how it came to be. But this section is called "We Decided to Help Ourselves." So it starts off with an indication of that intragroup solidarity being newsworthy. It says, locally, people are coming together with grassroots efforts like Compassion in Oakland, which is organizing volunteer escorts for elders in Oakland, Chinatown. That's We Take Care of Us, right? Compassion in Oakland is coming from within the community to offer care and support. And then we get to moral solidarity, those appeals coming from within the community of what do we need from the rest of elites and powerful folks in order to make this stop. This is what it says. More than 70 Asian organizations recently joined forces to recommend San Francisco and Oakland officials invest in culturally specific resources like support services for victims of trauma and healing programs for Asian and Black communities that are often pitted against each other. This is crucial, right? More than 70 Asian organizations, first of all, are standing together to call for San Francisco and Oakland officials to invest not in fixing this generically, not in whatever the officials might think is a suitable response, but specifically in these calls for culturally specific resources, support services, healing programs, right? Elevating that there's a very concrete and specific plea coming from within the communities affected that now is being asked of city officials. With that, let me offer 3 key takeaways before we let our panelists take it away. Number 1, solidarity applies across stages of reporting. Everything from deciding what's newsworthy to the sources you select and the questions you ask them and the framing and resulting narrative. Second, solidarity reporting is not new. It happens quite a bit and it happens across different areas, but it doesn't happen as often as many members of marginalized communities and affected communities might be better served by. So the most celebrated journalism in this country actually regularly displays solidarity with marginalized communities. That US journalism dating all the way back, I can show you examples from the 1700s if you would like, is in the business of standing up for people whose dignity is at stake. And that leads into the final takeaway, which is that solidarity reporting at its core really means that journalists center the lived experiences of people whose dignity is at stake in order to ensure an accurate story. If we're talking about the mayor without ever contacting the mayor's office, I think there's a problem with that story, right? How can that possibly account for what's going on? The same holds true when covering marginalized communities subjected to conditions not of their own making. So let me anticipate now a few questions that might be on your mind. You might be wondering, how do I get started actually doing this? How do I convince my editor to let me do this? And am I really qualified to report on anti-Asian racism? Do I know enough? Do I have enough of the grasp? Do I have the sources? Maybe not. So to address some of these questions and more, and your questions coming up, I'm going to turn it over now back to Cecilia to moderate our panel with the fantastic journalist who wrote the solidarity reporting stories I just showed you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. I think you all just got a taste of how much I loved being in Anita's class when I was at the Berkeley J School. I remember being in her class and just thinking how her framework of looking at reporting and the potential there for journalists was just so refreshing. I'm so glad you all got a taste of that. And if you were furiously taking notes or jotting down like some key takeaways, we are going to be sharing a recording of this at the end, and then also her slides, and we'll have a handy doc, so don't worry, you'll have all of that. And so now to put everything that you just digested from Anita into practice, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. And these are folks that Anita's just highlighted as journalists being engaged in solidarity reporting. And so I want to invite them to our quote unquote stage now. We're going to have Janelle Bitker, who is a food reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle. And then we'll also have Abené Clayton, who is a reporter with the Guardian US, and Vivian Ho, a former West Coast news reporter for Guardian US as well. So thank you so much for joining. I'm seeing if you are all unmuted. You are. Okay, well, why don't we start and just kick it off actually with you, Janelle. You are usually a food writer, but you also wrote this incredible in-depth piece, and it was also important to know, it was also multimedia. There were beautiful photos and videos, and then there was also your reporting as well. So I'm wondering, as a food writer, and I believe this was sort of the first major piece that came out of the Chronicle after what we were seeing going on during Lunar New Year. How did the story come to be? And then how did you navigate sort of the high stakes of writing this story?
It's a great question, and thanks so much for having me. I actually started the story last April when we were first hearing about some of these things happening, and a lot of people were talking about Trump's language. And one of my editors at the time just felt like we needed to come out with something big, something long form, something with video, and approached me and Leah Suzuki, the photographer that worked on the project, and just said, do you want to work together? And I never asked her why she chose me, but I assume it's because I had done a lot of reporting in Chinatown, mostly related to restaurants, but still talking to a lot of people in the community about gentrification and things like that. So I think she felt like I maybe had a head start on sourcing. And I moved really slowly because, as you said, I was a full-time food writer, and during the pandemic, there's been so many crazy food stories to cover nonstop. So I spent about 2 months trying to dedicate like 2 or 3 hours a week to reaching out to people and interviewing people. And I talked to a lot of people who did not end up in the final story. And ultimately, it didn't run right away because video takes a long time to edit. And by the time we were getting ready, June hit and George Floyd was killed, and we just felt like it was not the time for that story anymore, at least not yet. So we took a step back, and I'm sure a lot of journalists here can relate to when you have a sort of evergreen story on the back burner. Sometimes it just stays on the back burner for a really long time. And we also had a lot of leadership changes at the Chronicle. So the editor who wanted to work with me on that story left. And it was just one of those things where I feel like every couple months I brought it up to someone and it was like, maybe not yet, maybe not yet. And then the new year started, and then it was clearly time to revisit the story. And I did a little more reporting to ground it in the current moment. And that's how it came together.
Yeah, and I mean, sort of, like you said, I think a lot of journalists or reporters understand what that feeling is like, knowing something's important or there's an issue that's starting to bubble, but then it hits this peak. I mean, what was that like for you to sort of work so hard on something and then for it to be in the back burner and just wait for this opening for it to come to fruition?
It was frustrating, honestly. And it was frustrating because I felt like even before the new year started and there were so many attacks in Oakland, Chinatown, I still felt like it was important and relevant. And it was hard convincing, I think, some editors to agree. And it kind of needed to be like screaming at them, not me, but the events were screaming at them, for it to rise to like, okay, it's time to put resources toward this and it's time to not make you do a million food stories. So that was challenging, but the Chronicle's invested a lot in race and equity reporting very recently. The week that those attacks were making the news was actually the week that our new race and equity editor started. So in that sense, the timing was amazing, and I had a really fabulous editor to work with me on that.
And you're a food writer. I know you're also someone who reports in Chinatown quite often. And did that help you in terms of actually locating folks that were directly harmed or has gone experienced the racism firsthand. How did you navigate finding these sources, and how did you lean on your food reporting to do that?
It did help. I have a source at one of the main Chinatown activist organizations who's really, really helpful. And I emailed him right away, like, this is not ordinarily what I reach out to you about, but what do you think? Is there anyone you'd recommend I talk to? And I had some great interviews that way. Otherwise, I think I leaned on nonprofit organizations and other activists that I had not met yet. And also just, I think, being Asian and Leah being Asian, we just know a lot of Asians in the Bay Area, and word of mouth kind of helped. Seeing friends of friends posting things on social media, we were able to get directly to people that way as well.
Awesome. Great. And now I wanted to talk about the Guardian piece that Anita also brought up that was written by Vivian and Abené. When I first read the story, I was like, this is unique because first it's two people writing on two communities. You wrote this together. And I want to also just talk about the timing of the piece. It came out just as this widespread attention was happening against, the attacks against the Asian elderly. And then you dove into this really complicated, thorny issue around anti-Blackness in the Asian community. And how did you decide on that framing on that? And how receptive were editors to that framing, especially as the conversation was just starting to ramp up? And maybe I'll toss that to you, Abené, first.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I was seeing the reports, especially out of Oakland, Chinatown, and videos just awful of Asian elders just being abused left and right. Was seeing conversations bubble up and knew it was something that would end up being newsworthy. Saw it was a trend and was just like, okay, let me see what people are talking about. Because one thing that I know from being Black is whenever there's like a hella crime-ish spree, or there feels like this bubbling up of crime, oftentimes Black folks are scapegoated, and there are these really awful conversations that come up. And I started to see that, honestly. I saw a lot of really unfortunate commentary, assuming like, oh, well, what did the victims look like? A lot of the things that I'll see when an uptick in gun violence or robberies or anything like that comes up, there are always kind of these I call them like suburban nightmare kind of things that come up. And I saw that starting to happen, and I brought it up in a meeting. I think it kind of led off with like, oh, there is something happening among Asian elders that certainly needs attention. And at the same time, I'm seeing this proliferation of a lot of anti-Black sentiment and this sort of, this idea we need to protect our community, and this use of a lot of what I was more familiar with as being like, Black revolutionary talking points. And I was like, okay, Asians with attitude, very, I know where that comes from. That's interesting, but there's all this anti-Blackness with it. And it really came out of a place of like confusion and frustration. And then Vivian chimed in. It was her patch at the Guardian to do more Bay Area, California centric news. And we just kind of started a dialogue about that, and whatever we were talking about, I'm sure we were just like, whoa, back and forth in like a meeting for 10 minutes. But eventually our editors saw that there was something there, put us both on the story. And the focus was like, can we now talk about the very real tensions in Black communities and in Asian communities? Like, can we talk about it now? I think was what Vivian and I were both kind of getting at. It was like, this is happening. There are things that happen to Asian folks and hate crimes that go completely unaddressed. There's also this scapegoating of the Black community that goes unaddressed, and they're happening at the same time. And it just made sense for us to write about it. The premise of the story, we went back and forth with how much of the solidarity do we talk about? How much of the thorny aspects do we talk about? That was something that got worked out. But I would say that our editors were pretty, at least supportive of the idea of something about Black and Asian communities, but that left a lot of room for stumbling blocks, for I think things we had to recognize in ourselves that kind of you don't know is in you until you write it and someone else reads it and you're just like, oh, huh. So interesting. So it was nice to have Viv there to check us, but I really think it was mostly an effort of me and her getting ourselves together and then presenting stuff to our editors that they were like, okay, either this makes sense or it doesn't. But I feel like we were quite supported in terms of our topic choice. And I'd love to hear, well, sorry, Cecilia, if you have another question, but I would also love to hear Vivian's like experience of like from conception to publication, because I'm sure just as our perspectives on the issue are different, her experiences, I'm sure are different from mine.
Yeah. No, Vivian, chime in, please.
Yeah, it was one of those things like we were reporting kind of piecemeal, this and that, these attacks are happening. Celebrities are paying attention, this was happening. And then, the chatter was happening, right, on social media and everyone saw it and it was gross. And as, Abené is well aware, it's this sort of scapegoating happens whenever there's an uptick in crime. But, as a member of the Asian community, I mean, you kind of know that this sort of anti-Blackness is there. You kind of know that it exists. And so it's a very specific sort of scapegoating that happens. And to see it pop off, I recognized it. When I saw it happening in social media, I recognized it in the emails I was getting saying, what was the race of the suspects, that sort of stuff. And so when Abené brought it up at the meeting, we just immediately started going off, started talking about it, and our editors were just like, all right, fine, like, I guess you guys can do something. And
sorry.
So, we originally planned to do a story, it was going to take us a couple of days to do this story. It was such a complicated, such a messy ordeal to get through. We ended up writing through 2,500 words 3 times, completely straight through, just scratching it over, just because it's just such a complicated, thorny subject. Like, how do you write about racial divisions without really alienating either communities?
Yeah.
There were several times when I didn't even realize it, but I would write things. And this is coming from somebody like, I thought for sure that I thought I was anti-racist. I thought I was, free of this, but I would write things and then I would send it to Abené and I'd look back and Abené would clear it through. And, and I'd be like, oh my God, that was so racist what I wrote. And then I would talk to Abené, like, I'm so sorry that you saw that. I'm so sorry that you had to read that. And she's like, no, like, it's totally fine. And like, we would talk it over afterwards. And I ended up buying her dinner. That's what you do when you're accidentally racist. You buy dinner. So yes. But it gets a really complicated subject. And it's a really complicated topic, and it's one that we shouldn't shy away from because it's one that people need to be talking about. And that's one of the things that I found was most important with this story, is that nobody has a really free space to talk about this issue. Because if they bring it up, they're racists. And that's what a lot of activists and advocates are doing right now. They're trying to create a safe space for people to talk about this comfortably and feel okay talking about this. And I think a lot of journalists right now are afraid to write about this stuff because it's so complicated. But I think it's important that we do it because it's really hard and it took like 10 years off my life, but it's really important to do it because if we don't do it, then we're not going to be able to just learn from it and learn more and learn how to move on from it, really.
And it sounds like, Abené and Vivian, you were each other's sort of thought partners through this process and could bounce ideas off of. And we're holding up your story as an example of solidarity, but there's also just solidarity happening in the way that you're co-reporting and writing this. I mean, was that a unique experience for you all compared to, you both have reported on very complicated issues on your own, but what was it like to do this in tandem together, and what sorts of knowledge or perspectives were you leaning on from the other person?
I mean, I know for me, Viv very graciously mentions any misstep. She's confronted them very head on. Any times where it was like, oh girl, like, I don't want you to get dragged. I know that's problematic. I'm going to just like lightly change the wording here. You know, she was very upfront about any mistakes she's made there. But personally, like, I learned a lot. You know, I didn't realize that, please forgive me, everybody in this room, but I did not realize that the model minority myth was as harmful as it is. I knew that having any sort of stereotype, I knew that having any sort of like dehumanization kind of a category against you was bad, but somehow in my mind, I was just like, if that's the worst stereotype, then and reading what Viv would write made me realize like, no, that is still terrible. That's still something that is a racial injustice. That's still something that needs to be called out. And I learned a lot. You know, I didn't know that folks were being silenced, to use an Oprah term. I'm sorry. I thought people were being silent, but they were being silenced. And I didn't know that.
I love it. I love it.
Yes, I didn't want to, but here we are. I truly didn't know what was happening. And I had to realize like, damn, okay, like, let me let Vivian go off a little more, because she's not wrong, you know? And I think the moments where I may have had to be like, oh, this may be problematic, didn't make my experience any sort of negative. Like, all of the good and all the things that I learned about both Vivian and what folks in the Asian community in the Bay Area where I'm from are talking about has been so valuable and helped me realize, I mean, again, Viv talks about she bought me dinner. I was in another conversation about journalism and how hard it is for folks. And one of my Asian homegirls was really struggling. And I sent her, you know, a gift card to DoorDash. I was like, if someone can stand with me when I've been confronted with racism, like, I'm going to do that. You know, like, I've just been trying to do better in my own life. You know, we have a line in the story about the kind of righteous frustration that a lot of people were feeling when this issue finally, you know what I'm saying, hate against Asian Americans for a little while. And in some ways it did turn into a conversation about anti-Blackness. You know, it was a worthwhile conversation. It was something that absolutely needed to happen. But now that we've said it and it's out there and people know, like, I feel like it's really incumbent on me to just like elevate voices without like having to add my own 2 cents. Like, if I see some anti-Blackness, I'm gonna say something, but if someone's just talking about their experiences, like, go ahead and give that retweet, give a clap, like, push that forward. And if I didn't work with Viv, if this was something that I did on my own, I don't think, one, it wouldn't have been as good. And 2, I don't think I would have learned as much. You know, I would have been like, I know what's going on here, and I'm just gonna write about it with a few insights from organizers, and I'm gonna keep it moving. But I mean, I didn't know how little I knew about people I've been interacting with, like Black people and Asian people, especially in the Bay Area. Like, we're so intertwined, but there are so many like unique experiences that I simply had no clue about. And it, you know, it really changed the way I see this. I've seen this issue going forward, and then doing like gun violence coverage. And when Atlanta happened, it really just came together in a salient way that I wouldn't have understood if I hadn't gotten the chance to work with Viv.
Yeah. I mean, just to add just 2 cents on this, the reason why, I mean, working for a national news organization, I work for Vox Media, but like working for a national news organization now, the perspectives we have as a Bay Area community, and I'm just so glad that Vivian and Abené, you brought that to the forefront through just beyond a local outlet, because I think that there is a unique perspective. So many of the viral videos were happening, you know, coming from the Bay Area, and people were talking about it. I'm like, but we have this Bay Area perspective and this dynamic that needs to be put to the forefront. And I'm so glad that you both did that. So I just wanted to show that appreciation. Anita, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Yeah, and I want to echo that appreciation for all 3 of our panelists and for Cecilia's ongoing coverage of these issues. Incredibly crucial and important. My question zooms out a bit from the particular stories to consider a theme that I think you've all touched on, which is this matter of elevating voices and who gets to be a source, who gets to be heard in news coverage. So a major difference between solidarity reporting and more elite-focused reporting is exactly that: who gets to speak and be heard, and who decides what we call injustices. Some terms that have been circling around are hate crimes, racism, terrorism. So this is a question for all three of you. Whoever would like to start is welcome to. USA Today issued a statement on March 18th that they would not label the Atlanta shooting a hate crime, and that they would not label the shooter a white supremacist or terrorist because, and I'm quoting here, "We wait for the agency leading the investigation to apply these labels based on their investigations, and law enforcement makes a determination based on motive," end quote, from USA Today. What do you think of this stance?
Well, we waited for the police, it would still just be a bad day, wouldn't it? But I mean, I was really upset the first night of the Atlanta shooting because I noticed that a lot of news organizations, they were reporting shootings at Atlanta area spas, Atlanta area massage parlors, and they made no reference to the fact that they were Asian owned. Like, they were very specifically Asian owned spas. And for that reason, 6 out of 8 of the victims were Asian women. That is significant. And it was known at that time that they were Asian women, that they were Asian owned businesses. So hate crimes, by definition, like, it has its own definition. Like, we can't say it's a hate crime. I understand that. We can't say it's we can't say it's hate related. We can't say it's terrorism. They have definitions. Words mean things. We get it. But we can say facts. And the fact is that these were Asian owned businesses that were targeted. We have a responsibility to say that, in fact.
Thank you for that. Abené or Janelle, did you want to add anything?
Did you go ahead, Janelle? Janelle, go ahead.
I was just going to agree with Vivian. I think as like news organizations, we're always talking about definitions and the importance of words, and internally we don't always agree about definitions of words. And so I can see how USA Today would come to that conclusion. And to be honest, I didn't read USA Today's coverage, so I don't know what the rest of it was like. Based on that stance, I can make some guesses, but I think more than labeling something with a word, the entire coverage is what really matters.
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely agree with everything that's been said. In lieu of being able to like label something a hate crime, it doesn't mean that reporters just throw their hands up and don't present the like overwhelming evidence that this was motivated by hate, to put in the context of like this exotification and fetishization of Asian women is not going to lead to an email from like the FBI, like, hey, don't call it a hate crime. Like, this is not going to happen. Present it in a way, make it plain so people understand why there's so much frustration when news outlets are like, we're not going to call this a hate crime flat out. You know, like, and like Janelle said, like, I understand why a news site would be like, we're going to be cautious. We're going to wait for, you know, law enforcement. There's so many issues with like any sentence that starts with police say and just leaves it at that. But in this specific context, like just putting in the facts of the matter, people can realize without, you know, using the word hate crime, but just the flat out, like, no, we're not going to call it that, just made me really uneasy, and it felt very dismissive. And it's like, if it's not a hate crime, then what? Like, you know, like Vivian said, it would have just been another bad day. You know what I'm saying? Another misunderstood white kid who had a toughie, but we know it was much more than that. I'm sorry, hopefully no cops are on the line right now. I don't know if I should have said that.
We are moving into sort of the Q&A section of this. If folks have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them into the chat. And we also want to see or hear from you all. So if you want to ask a question, we could read it out loud. But if you also want to unmute yourselves and pose the question to our panelists too. That'd be great. We did see a couple of questions. There was one from Emily John. I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly. I don't know if you want to ask the questions or I could read it.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. My question was actually for Janelle, and I apologize because I kind of tuned in late to this conversation, so you may have already talked about this, but I was curious, you mentioned like your story idea was sort of pitched initially like a year or so ago, and I was just curious how, it might have changed, or the conversations around your story changed as it was finally getting developed and published.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. It honestly didn't change that much, which is maybe horrible, but the root issues, especially because I was really looking at why we thought this was happening on a greater level and the history, and really focusing on context and also lived and emotional experience of the people who were harmed. Most of it didn't need to change, but I did want to update like the data we had. And I also mainly needed to think about the Oakland Chinatown attacks and what they really meant. And I think at that point, the dominant narrative I was seeing was, these are hate crimes. And the community organizers I was talking to were like, well, we don't know if they're hate crimes, right? They're crimes of opportunity. They're still targeting a group, which is bad, but they didn't want to say they were hate crimes. So that nuance, I think, needed to be added to the story as well. It's not so simple.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. I was also just curious too, not to like assume the worst in a newsroom, but I was curious if folks at the Chronicle were like, oh shit, like we're overdue for a story, like can you hurry this up, or something you've been working on for a long time? Or was your experience a little better than that and like sort of finally getting it through the way you wanted it?
Spill the tea, Janelle.
also sorry, I'm really new to the Chronicle, so you don't have to say anything you don't want to talk about.
No, it felt rushed at the end. I was happy with the way it turned out ultimately, but it did feel a little bit like a oh shit moment on behalf of leadership, and like, oh wait, we know Janelle already has this story, so let's quickly get it in shape. But I mean, the irony there was that they didn't remember that we had this video component we really wanted to do. And I think it was so much more powerful to be able to hear from the people directly and see the emotion in their faces. So we ended up waiting a couple of weeks anyway because of the video, which again, ultimately I think was the right decision because it was much more powerful altogether.
We also have a really great question from Fariha. Fariha, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Thanks everyone for sharing everything that you've already shared. It's been really insightful. Local news perspective, when you're relying on AP Wire or just national outlets and what they're getting first, when you're all the way in the Bay Area and the info is coming from Atlanta, how do you avoid like being complicit in sharing what they share first when we don't know everything? Like I think when we shared this, we used AP, and I think they led with the fact that it was like massage parlors and spas, and then we found out later that they were Asian. And this is for anyone to answer.
Anita, I wonder if you have an answer for this.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That is a fantastic question. So some of my research that I didn't talk about today is around this idea of how fast journalism should be to serve the communities and publics that they're seeking to serve. A good friend of mine, Mike and Annie, he's at USC, and he wrote a piece, How Fast or Slow Does Journalism Need to Be? There's an assumption that faster is better, but if faster is wrong, as in factually incorrect, then we might have to pause and wonder, well, first of all, what's happening in these national outlets that are putting out claims that are later, rendered incomplete or completely not the case in terms of what's been happening, not only in the case of the Atlanta shooting, but other cases too, of course. And at the level of what the flow is into local news outlets or metro outlets, how do we press pause, right? Just because a national outlet is offering this doesn't necessarily mean to take it at face value. The other piece I think that often stems from is what past experience has been with that national source. And so if past experience with a national source has generally been good, there's often an assumption it'll continue to be good. But a lot of journalists who I work with and adore are highly skeptical people. And I really encourage that, particularly when we consider that the makeup of even a highly diverse newsroom that doesn't have a mission focused on racial equity is very likely to be inferior to folks that are, or organizations that are racial equity focused from the outset. So keeping in mind that that may tinge what you're getting. But I also think that, it's often not on the individual journalist in the sense that they may not be the one making that call. And what I tell every journalist and journalism student I work with is that regardless of the outcome, don't forget that it's worth having the conversation. If the shooting has happened and you're seeing this rapid fire information coming out about it, can you ask the question, was there a racial dimension to what's happening here? Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but is that a question you can ask? And if we don't know from the national source, is there an editorial conversation about, should we hold? Should we even go with this? What don't we know? Will we be falling into that trap that we saw so often in 2015 and 2016 of amplifying false claims, right? And I know that so many news organizations have really vowed and tried to do the work of doing better, but sometimes, it's hard to break those patterns of sourcing that would be agnostic about what the content is. So I would encourage the conversation in that sense, and also to have it be a question, not necessarily a set of answers that you expect to have of yourself, but to be asking yourself, well, what don't I know based on what I'm getting here? Janelle, did you want to add anything, or Vivian?
Well, yeah, I was thinking, it's hard the night of that is fair, especially if you're reporting on, you're taking off of the wire, and you're relying on the wire source on what they're saying, and they're saying massage parlor, that's what they're saying. But I mean, if they're reporting on the individual massage parlor, and I mean, you have the name of the massage parlor, and you can look up, the name on the Secretary of State website and who owns it. You can source that, and I mean, there's significance to that, who owns it and why this individual chose 3 specifically Asian-owned massage parlors. And I think that's important for people just to remember. And it would have been, it's just one of those things that I feel like people should have. It was something that people were aware of early on in the night, as the shooting was unfolding, that these were Asian-owned businesses. I think that was information that came out pretty early on, and this was information that could have been verified from afar. But it is difficult. I do acknowledge that, especially when you're just relying on wire stuff. But I think where we can jump off of that as journalists is what we can do the day after, and what we can do with the story after that. Because in this day and age when everything's now, we need to stop asking who has it first and start asking not who has it first, but who can do the story correctly. And one big thing I still haven't seen this story anywhere is that not all these massage parlors are these den of iniquities that people keep painting them out to be. Like, there are all these massage parlors in Chinatown and stuff, and like they're just these ladies trying to earn a living. Like, where are the why aren't reporters going out to the massage parlors there and talking to them and asking them how they're feeling in the aftermath of the shooting? Like, are they feeling safe? Are they worried? Are they scared for their safety? Yeah, that's a story I wanted to do before I left the Guardian, but my last day was on Friday, so yeah.
You're living that freelance life now.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just if there's other questions, please everyone continue dropping them in the chat. We also are very mindful of time. We really want to keep to our promise of getting everyone out of here by 6 o'clock. So it looks like we won't be doing the breakout rooms, but certainly please ask questions in this big major room that we're in together. And we hope to get to all your questions for the panelists and for Anita too. And just to kind of switch gears just a little bit, just talking about the Atlanta shootings. I mean, I remember the day after, it was a heavy news day, a long production personally in my newsroom. And then AAJA, the national board, held this just a mental health space where all these Asian American journalists from all these different newsrooms gathered together. It was a safe space. And everyone had collectively just a terrible day. But it was very comforting after a long work day to know that there was other people who felt the same way. And so, posing to you all, like, how do you take care of yourself when you're writing stories this painful about racism, about people getting attacked? And how can journalists deal with mental health during this time when we're all, hoping to stay healthy and well so we can keep reporting? What are your tips?
Go ahead, Janelle. You go ahead, girl.
The day after the Atlanta shootings was really hard. I couldn't focus that day at all, and my editor, thankfully, was just like, hey, I understand if this is a rough day and if you need to take off early or if you need to just peace for a bit, do it, which I really appreciated. And I baked a cake during work, which was nice. And similarly, after the storming of the Capitol, not exactly the same thing, but I think evidence of a rise in white supremacy was a really worrisome day for a lot of people. And we did a little 10-minute yoga session in the middle of the workday, just like self-care, breathe a little. And that felt amazing too. So just those little breaks for yourself on, like, allow yourself to take them, even though you have a lot going on.
Yeah. For me, like I mentioned, I cover gun violence like full time, have been for a couple years. And I will definitely, I've thought about, like, how do you take care of yourself? That's a question people regularly ask me. How do you deal with this? And early on, honestly, it's before these past couple months, which have kind of made me kick self-care into high gear a little bit. I really, I'm very like sad movie phobic. Like, there are a lot of movies, like, honestly, I can't watch Boys in the Hood. I can't watch a lot of like gritty crime dramas anymore. I can't really listen to trap music. I've noticed that early into my reporting, I would listen, I'd be at the club, I'm out having a good time, and I'll hear a line that's like, yeah, and then I bust so-and-so's head open. I'm just like, but he is a mom, and I have to talk to her. Like, it was too much. So that's kind of been something that I've just incorporated into my everyday life, being very selective of the content and what I'm putting into my eyes after work, and just being mindful of how it makes me feel, and recognizing, like, it is okay to only watch like comedies and Drag Race for the rest of your life, because we cover such hard topics. And like Janelle said, just allowing yourself to take care of yourself in that way has been something that I'm still learning to do. And then this last month or so has been exceptionally difficult. I've covered the rise in gun violence since the pandemic started. Gun violence has just been ticking upwards in communities, and it's something that I've covered. But I didn't realize how much more difficult it would be to cover this kind of stuff when everybody was paying attention again. Like, Atlanta happened, and then right after that was Boulder. And then all of a sudden there were these like gun violence is back, the mass shootings, and this chaos amid me already feeling like a baseline of stress, knowing that people are being shot every day, to see it happen again in the context of these like out of the blue lone wolf style shootings that we really hadn't seen that many of. It just made me so anxious and so tired. So I definitely embraced the nap. I didn't tell myself like, no, don't take a nap now, you're not gonna be able to go to sleep. I mean, like, sleep when you have to. Sometimes that's your body's way of like protecting itself from a full meltdown. So go ahead and take that nap. And then I try to tell myself like, I'll do little things like, I'm going to go ahead and cook myself dinner. Like, yes, the world may be complete crap and I have to write about it and talk to the people who face it. But like, at least my hair is clean. My sheets are changed. My room ain't dusty. Like, those little things have been really helpful, like doing little chores here and there, just being like, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and walk to pick up the food instead of getting like DoorDash, just anything to kind of get me out of my apartment, off Twitter and all that has been something that it's like I've been trying to embrace more, but still think I have a ways to go. But just being like, I'm gonna enjoy this. I'm gonna enjoy detangling my hair. It's not gonna be another task that I have to do. It's going to be something that I'm doing for myself, because like I said, everything can be crap, but like my hair looks okay, and sometimes that's all we got.
The day after the Atlanta shooting, my editor was like, oh, can you go to Chinatown and just get reaction? I'm like, yeah, sure, totally, I can do that. And then like, the next hour, she's like, oh, did you go to Chinatown yet? I'm like, no, just, next hour, I made some phone calls. It's cool. And she's like, all right, cool, and she's like, all right, so did you go to Chinatown yet? I'm like, no, I'm working on it, just, I got some phone calls in, it's cool. And then like, next hour, she's like, all right, so have you been in Chinatown? Yeah. I'm like, no, just working on it. And then like, my husband's just like, are you going to Chinatown? And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to Chinatown. Yeah, it's fine. And eventually he's just like, are you afraid to leave the apartment? And I'm like, no, I'm not. I go like, no, like, why would I be afraid to leave the apartment? Like, babies are afraid to leave the apartment. Like, I'm not a baby. Like, I'm like, what are you talking about? But like, it's, like, I mean, like, you don't realize the sort of anxieties that kind of build up when you're watching videos of people punched over and over again, just replay on social media. But it happens. And, like, I was very unkind to myself that day. Like, like that, the sort of like pump up thing that you do like in the mirror, like, like I just remember you're like, you fucking idiot, like just get the fuck out the door, that sort of thing, and I just had to get out. And so I did that. And I just remember I was on edge the entire time. But it's, I think we all just have to be a little more forgiving with ourselves and like realize that like we're human beings too. And watching someone get punched over and over again, watching old ladies get punched over and over again who look like our grandmothers, that's gonna have consequences.
Absolutely. And I just want to jump in on the research perspective here, which is watching it over and over again, right? That has an effect on journalists, on folks who are viewing it in your audiences, both within the communities affected and outside of them. And it relates to vicarious traumatization, right? And when folks are vicariously traumatized, they can start to go numb. They can go desensitized and start to turn away from the issue, which I think is a really, really deeply problematic aspect of the kind of isolated incident reporting that starts and ends with the grandmas getting punched, right? Whereas with the solidarity reporting approach, there's actually no evidence, and I look for it every day in case something changes, but there's no evidence that with solidarity reporting that people become vicariously traumatized. And I think that's a really important consideration, because the other aspect of vicarious traumatization, and this is not about individuals being bad people or anything like that, is that there can start to be a psychological process of victim blaming in an attempt to emotionally regulate. It's, well, did they bring it on themselves somehow? And that's really, really pernicious, both for reporters and for your larger audiences and society writ large, which is one last plug for solidarity reporting as a way that can take us in the direction of continuing to report on these issues, to not turn off and say, well, I'll cover something lighter, because that's not going to get us anywhere either, but to cover them with this constructive approach of grounding it in what are communities calling for. And related to that, very quickly, I just wanted to address a question in the chat from Claudia, who raised the point that this issue of naming victims. So she notes that groups that work directly with the families learned that some of the families did not want the victims' names to be released, in some cases for culturally specific reasons, and some national outlets shared them anyway. How can journalists who want to practice solidarity pay respect to these kinds of important nuances? I think this is a whole bigger conversation that I would be very excited to have with any of you who are interested. But this issue of consent and needing to realize that publicity does not mean the same thing for all communities, all people, all backgrounds. This comes up quite a bit when we talk about news photography as well. If you're in public, does every community view that as the same version of being in public, therefore publicly accessible? Not always. And those conversations really need to happen much more to understand, the public's right to know, the public's need to know. It also needs to include a conception of the public that would not view this as upholding their community members' dignity. And that means ultimately one size does not fit all, but these acts of solidarity and these approaches of solidarity really need to center both the perspectives of sources and also, their needs and their concerns. Again, the conversation might take it in a different direction to say, well, here's why these names might be relevant to the story. Explaining that could lead to a different understanding. But if it doesn't, there's really a terrible hypocrisy in trying to claim that I'm doing solidarity reporting by covering this, but also ignoring the wishes of the people who have lost someone. With that, I want to say thank you to our panelists and turn it back over to Cecilia to close us out. Thank you all again.
Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists. So much of the mission of AAJA is finding community with reporters who are like-minded, who are struggling through the same sort of thorny topics and also taking care of ourselves. So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing the space with us. I want to promise we're 3 minutes away from the end of our meeting, and I want to give you back your time so you can get dinner, walk your dogs, watch your Netflix, whatever it is you need to do. But I'll be thinking about this conversation for a long time. And I just want to reiterate how much the board and I appreciate all of you. And we're so moved to see so many people show up with interest and care on this topic. From the moment myself and the rest of this board took office at the beginning of the year, we've been really thinking hard about how we can meet this moment as Asian American journalists. And I'm just really glad that we're here with all of you right now. And I don't want to leave without some really quick thank yous. First, again, to Anita for being an incredible thought partner through all of this and just making sense of all of this. And I think she's done that for all of you tonight too, especially during such a fraught time. She brings a clarity, and I hope you all are walking away from this conversation with some takeaways. Thanks to SPJ NorCal for their support and their collaboration, including Liz Enox and Ida Mujadad, who helped keep the show running in the background. And a really special shout out to Kristen Wong for DJing this big Zoom event and troubleshooting everything from beginning to end, while also wrapping up her thesis at the J School. You're a rock star. Thank you. And thanks to Sarah Bell Lynn for championing this event from day one and bringing an incredible perspective to the table. And of course, our other AAJ board members, Mari Carmendoza, Harry Mock, Sonia Paul, Jocelyn Duffy. And, please refer to our resource doc to stay in touch with us. And I'll turn it to Anita to share that with all of you.
Yeah, thank you all again for being here, and tremendous thanks to Cecilia for all of her leadership. I did drop in the chat a resource document. That's the link I just put in again, that has links to the slides from today, as well as links to more examples of solidarity reporting, as well as some of the resources, including the DART Center and others, and guidance from AAJA, as well as more resources about solidarity reporting. With that in mind, I would like to remain in solidarity meet with each of you, which means I very much hope this is not the last encounter we have with each other. My contact information and Cecilia's contact information are in the resource doc, which I'll drop once more because Zoom chat continues scrolling. So we really encourage you to stay in touch. Please reach out with any questions, ideas, conversations you'd like to have. And I wish you all safety and support. Thank you again. Be well.